Sire, grant this reprieve, lest innocent blood be spilled. The accused swears his loyalty to the crown.
There are children who enter the world with soft cries and warm embraces. And then there are children who arrive as if a new wound has been cut open on the fate of an entire kingdom. And Edward VI was precisely that kind of child. Born not in peace, but in the ghastly echo of beheading swords. Execution scaffolds, accusations of adultery, and the deaths that haunted every corner of the Tudor court. Because long before he opened his eyes, Henry VIII, his father, swollen with obsession and fear of legacy, had torn England apart with 6 marriages, 1 schism from Rome, and countless bodies sacrificed to his hunger for a male heir. So when Edward first cried, no one really heard the cry of a baby. They heard the exhale of a nation that had waited far too long for a legitimate son. An exhale that tasted more like blood than relief. From that very moment, Edward's life was no longer his own, because the entire realm had stretched itself tight with dread and expectation. And the death of Jane Seymour, his gentle mother, the only queen Henry VIII truly loved just days after childbirth, transformed the infant into a symbol of both mourning and salvation. As though he hadn't been born of life, but of a brutal exchange. A queen must die, so a future king may breathe. Even his first breath carried the weight of guilt. Heavy, like night fog in a chapel, abandoned by hope, people said Henry VIII never cried. But when Jane died, he wandered Hampton Court like a restless shadow, clutching his newborn son, not because he longed to be a father, but because he had sacrificed too much to create him. And willingly or not, Edward became a living relic, a cruel reminder that the fall of Anne Boleyn, the destruction of Catherine Howard, the ashes of the Catholic nuns, all of it had been worth it. Edward did not grow up held by tenderness, but by the cold machinery of the Tudor court. A world where words were soft, but ambitions were sharp enough to flay innocence. And the people assigned to raise him were not caretakers of childhood but engineers of ideology, tasked with molding him into the perfect Protestant monarch and sealing him off from a world cracked open by his father's brutality. From the beginning he was isolated so thoroughly that even laughter became alien to him. Because in the palace, no one taught him kindness, or warmth, or how to trust. Instead, they taught him that the world was divided into only 2 kinds of people, those of the correct faith and those meant to be extinguished. These lessons were poured into his young mind by fanatical tutors who saw in him not a boy, but a divine opportunity to rewrite England in fire. And slowly, the simple purity of childhood warped into something cold and crystalline, like ice forming inside a place where light could no longer reach. He never had friends, never ran freely beneath the sun, never knew what it meant to be held without purpose, because every step he took was watched, every breath documented, as if the future of a nation beat inside the tiny ribs of a child who wasn't allowed to be a child at all. In that suffocating isolation, Edward's soul became a hollow corridor, echoing with sermons rather than affection, crammed with commands instead of comfort. He learned that compassion was weakness, that fear was a tool, that God demanded purging rather than mercy. And day after day, he memorized death sentences as effortlessly as he memorized scripture, until cruelty and righteousness blurred together into the only language he understood. On winter nights, some servants whispered that they heard him crying alone in his chambers. But the crying was always quiet, suppressed, strained, as if he feared that even his tears might be judged sinful, as if vulnerability itself were a crime before God. So he rose earlier, prayed longer, studied harder, disciplining himself with the desperation of someone terrified of divine punishment. And in that terror he learned not only obedience but detachment, shaping the kind of spirit that could read about executions with the same calm one saves for reading weather notes. It was not hatred that grew inside him, it was emptiness. And when Henry VIII finally began to rot, literally rot, his limbs ulcerating, his breath putrid, Edward watched without flinching, because he had been taught that kings do not die, that death is merely the door through which power passes into new hands. When that enormous, terrifying man who had carved a kingdom by blood took his final breath, there was no wailing, no outburst of grief. There was only the clinking sound of destiny's chains, slipping neatly into place around a 9-year-old child who stepped toward the throne not with joy, not with sorrow, but with the silent acceptance of someone who had never been asked whether he wanted any of this at all. There is a kind of silence that does not come from peace, but from collective fear. A silence so thick, it settles on the rafters like dust, and hangs in the air like breath held too long. And that was the silence that fell over England the moment Edward VI sat upon the throne. A small boy with legs that did not yet reach the floor. A face too delicate for the crown that pressed onto his scalp like a weight meant for a different species altogether. Yet what unsettled the people who watched him was not his youth, nor his fragility, nor even the unnatural speed with which power had fallen into his lap. It was the expression he wore, a calmness far too still for childhood, a composure that seemed almost practiced, as if he had rehearsed this moment alone in his chambers long before his father's corpse cooled, when he looked out at the sea of nobles kneeling before him. He did not blink with shyness or tremble with nerves. He simply observed them, eyes clear and cold, like a child studying insects, trapped beneath a glass jar. The palace, once filled with the thunderous footsteps of Henry VIII, now felt hollow, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to the absence of a king who had eaten space the way he had eaten wives. And in that vacuum, Edward's quiet presence became unnervingly loud. His counselors fussed around him with the frantic energy of men trying to steer a ship whose captain was technically a child. But Edward did not behave like a child at all. He sat upright, rigid, absorbing every whispered scheme and every nervous bow with the stillness of someone who had been taught from infancy that emotion was dangerous and softness was treason. At first, the council ignored the eerie precision with which he listened, attributing it to good breeding or extraordinary discipline. But soon they began to notice other things, how his gaze lingered too long on reports of executions, how his little hand moved with unfaltering steadiness when signing orders, how he asked questions not about mercy or consequences, but about procedure, legal justification, doctrinal purity. The servants, who saw more than anyone intended, whispered among themselves that the palace felt wrong somehow, as though childhood itself had been banished from the corridors, leaving only the hollow echo of footsteps, too light to belong to a king, and yet too heavy to belong to a boy. They said Edward rarely smiled, rarely laughed, rarely even spoke unless spoken to. And when he did, his voice carried a calm surety completely at odds with the softness of its pitch. Some swore they had seen him watching executions from behind a balcony screen, his face blank as smoke curled up from the pyre below, his eyes flickering with a fascination that was not cruelty exactly, but something colder, something like curiosity, stripped of empathy, as if he were witnessing not a human being dying, but a moral equation being solved. What frightened the council most, though they never admitted it aloud, was the journal. Edward kept it with meticulous devotion, recording not his feelings or dreams or childish fears, but the operations of the state executions, rebellions, laws passed, punishments administered, and he wrote of them with a clinical detachment that made the ink on the page feel colder than steel. When his uncle Thomas Seymour was executed, Edward wrote only one sentence, flat and emotionless. The Lord Admiral was condemned to death and died. No grief, no shock, no memory of being held by the man as a toddler. Just a line, neat and crisp. The way one might note that rain had fallen or that a new psalm had been sung. That was when some counselors realized, with a chill that settled into their bones, that the boy was not merely obedient, he was devoutly, frighteningly convinced of his own righteousness inside Edward's mind. The throne was not a prize, nor a burden, but a divine directive. A role he had been shaped for since the moment he drew breath. And he carried it with the unwavering conviction of someone who had never been allowed to imagine an alternative. He believed fully, absolutely, that God had placed him here to purify England, to cleanse it of superstition and error, to enforce a truth that had been whispered into his ear since he learned to speak. And because he saw the world through this lens, he regarded disobedience, not as rebellion, but as sin. Something to be extinguished with the same detached firmness with which one plucks a weed from a garden before it spreads. To a tender-hearted king, such a worldview might have caused anguish. But to Edward, it offered clarity, purpose, and a simplicity that made him steadier than any child and far more terrifying. Yet in the long hours of night, when the palace lights dimmed and only the echo of old tragedies wandered through the halls, there were moments when his young face betrayed a flicker of something raw and unguarded, as if some part of him still remembered loneliness. He still remembered the cold silence of his nursery, where no mother had ever sung him to sleep. It still remembered the way affection had been rationed like a dangerous substance. But those flickers passed quickly, swallowed by a rigidity that had been drilled into him since infancy, and by dawn the cold mask was restored. As if tenderness itself had been a dream, he was ashamed to have glimpsed. Thus the first months of Edward's reign settled over England like an unseasonal frost, quiet and beautiful in its precision, but carrying underneath it the unmistakable promise of death. Because the kingdom was now in the hands of a boy who did not understand childhood and did not seek comfort. A boy raised on doctrine instead of love. A boy who believed God spoke through the crackling flames of execution fires, and those flames, once lit, would soon grow into a blaze that no one, not even the child king who ordered them, could control. There are moments in history when cruelty arrives not with the roar of an angry tyrant, but with the quiet scratch of a child's quill. And in the early months of Edward VI's reign, this unsettling contrast revealed itself with terrifying clarity. Because while the boy king's body remained small and slight, his beliefs, those rigid, inherited doctrines pressed into him, since infancy had already grown sharper than any sword. And when he turned his gaze toward England's ancient Catholic traditions, he did so with a cold, absolute certainty that felt too old for his young face, as though he were merely the mouth through which a harsher force spoke. It began slowly, almost politely, with proclamations written in elegant language about purifying worship and rightly ordering the kingdom under the true faith. But within weeks that politeness peeled away to reveal the brutal machinery beneath. And the palace, once filled with hymns and Latin whispers, became the command center of a child who believed he was chosen to burn falsehood out of the world. Across England, the destruction unfolded like a sickness spreading through the veins of a dying body. Steady and unstoppable. Statues of saints that had stood for centuries were torn from their pedestals and smashed against stone floors until their faces split. their hands cracked off like brittle branches. Their eyes shattered as if the boy king himself could not stand to meet their painted gaze. Stained, glass windows depicting miracles were broken and swept away, leaving only the cold skeletons of empty frames that let in harsh, unfiltered light. Ancient icons were hacked apart by men who murmured that they were doing God's work. And the gold of chalices and crucifixes was melted down into shapeless ingots, wealth stripped from the sacred, as if holiness itself were an obstacle to Edward's new vision. Yet Edward never visited these sites, never walked through the debris of centuries crushed into dust. He observed it all from afar, in his small hand, turning pages in reports written by ministers eager to please him. And when he read about smashed altars or burned prayer books, the corners of his mouth did not lift in satisfaction nor fall in horror. He simply read on, as if cataloging a necessary, inevitable cleansing. But what chilled those around him most deeply was not the destruction of objects. It was the destruction of people. Priests who refused to abandon Latin liturgy, monks who clung to ancient rites, laymen who still wore rosaries. These were no longer erring neighbors but enemies of divine truth in the eyes of a 9-year-old who had been taught that mercy towards sin was itself a form of disobedience to God. Edward did not witness the executions firsthand, but he did not need to. Reports of burnings and hangings arrived at his desk regularly, detailing the charges, the confessions, the final prayers, the crackle of flames around the ankles of those condemned. And Edward read these accounts with the same absorbed focus he brought to studying Greek grammar. In the margins of his journal, he wrote 4 words that chilled even the hardened diplomats who saw them later. They died for error. A child wrote that, a child with ink on his fingertips and religious fire in his breath. A child who had already learned to accept death, not as tragedy, but as correction. The palace began to change in ways subtle yet suffocating. Chapels that once echoed with Catholic chant now resounded with Reformed psalms, stripped bare of ornament until the very air seemed to vibrate with coldness. The priests who had served the Tudors for decades found themselves dismissed, imprisoned, or dragged to the stake alongside those who refused to yield. And the surviving clergy who remained learned quickly to preach not with conviction but with fear, knowing that the boy king's silence concealed a rigid intolerance sharper than any adult monarch had ever possessed. Even the counselors began to tread carefully, lowering their voices when discussing anything Catholic in Edward's presence, for they had come to understand that beneath his gentle appearance lay an unbending will, shaped not by experience, but by indoctrination. So deep it had hollowed out parts of him where compassion should have grown. What made this first purge uniquely terrifying was its innocence. Not innocence of morality, but innocence of age. The innocence of a child who did not yet know the weight of a life, who had never held the hand of someone dying, who had never knelt beside a body going cold, and therefore saw no contradiction between the softness of his youth and the harshness of his orders. He believed he was saving England by purifying it through fire. Believed he was doing what heaven required. Believed the flames that swallowed Catholics were the same flames that once guided prophets in the desert. He believed all of this with a wholehearted simplicity that made his actions even more frightening. Because righteousness in the hands of a child becomes a weapon without self-doubt. A blade that cuts cleanly and without hesitation. And outside the palace, the people watched with a growing dread that seeped into homes and markets and taverns. Because they began to understand something no one wanted to admit aloud. England was being reshaped by the mind of a boy who had never tasted kindness, who had been starved of affection and fed only doctrine, who wielded royal power the way a child wields imagination limitlessly, without caution. Without understanding the depth of the world he was trying to burn clean. The fires he lit were not just physical flames but spiritual ones. Flames that would spread from county to county, village to village, igniting resentments and terror that would scar the kingdom long after the boy himself turned to dust. Thus, the first purge of Edward VI was not merely the beginning of a policy, it was the beginning of a reign built on the terrifying clarity of a child convinced he was God's chosen instrument. And in the quiet halls of the palace, where servants stepped softly and counselors whispered prayers, they no longer dared to speak aloud. The shadows lengthened across the floor, stretching toward the throne where a small boy sat reading accounts of burnings with a serene, unblinking calm, unaware that with each life extinguished, he was carving deeper into England, a wound that would take generations to heal. There are rebellions that roar into existence with steel and fury. Rebellions born from ambition or treachery, or the hunger for power. But the rebellion that rose from the quiet fields of Devon and Cornwall began not with a shout, but with a prayer. A soft plea whispered by villagers who had watched their world dissolve beneath the reforms of a child king who had never stepped foot on their soil. And all they wanted pathetically, innocently, heartbreakingly, was to keep the mass they had known their entire lives. The mass their parents had whispered over their graves. The mass spoken in Latin. The language of their remembrance and devotion. Yet in the England of Edward VI, even such a modest request was treated as a threat. Because a boy raised to believe that one version of faith was pure and all others poisonous could not imagine that a prayer could be anything but obedience. And so when the villagers resisted the destruction of their traditions, Edward's government did not send envoys or negotiators, they sent soldiers. The uprising began like a ripple on water. Small at first, barely noticeable. A gathering of farmers and fishermen holding rosaries between calloused fingers, murmuring that they wanted only the old mass back. Not treason, not war. Just the right to worship as they had for generations. But that ripple soon grew into a swell, driven by fear, by hunger, by the crushing realization that the reforms being forced upon them were not simply political changes, but the dismantling of their spiritual lives. And as rumors of churches stripped bare and priests dragged away drifted through the countryside, more villagers joined, carrying not swords but torches, lit not for revolt, but for remembrance. They marched not like conquerors, but like mourners, their voices rising with hymns, older than the Tudor throne. And for a brief moment they dared to believe that their king, a boy, a child, a young soul they imagined still capable of innocence, might hear them. But the king did not hear them. Or perhaps he did, and simply did not care. What matters is that the response came not in mercy but in fire. Edward's advisors, panicked by the notion of defiance, convinced the boy that this was not a gentle plea but a heretical uprising, a rebellion against God's will. And Edward, armed with the certainty of someone who had never questioned the teachings carved into him, approved measures so brutal they might have made even his father hesitate. Thus began the march of royal forces into the West Country. A column of steel advancing against men who carried little more than farming tools. And when the armies met near Exeter, the rebellion changed instantly from a hymn into a slaughter. The siege of Exeter was a nightmare stretched across summer heat. A long, suffocating confrontation in which townspeople, trapped behind their own walls, watched supplies run out and bodies pile up, while outside the royal soldiers prepared to answer a prayer with annihilation. Reports from the time describe starvation so severe that citizens ate whatever they could find. Desperation creeping through the alleys like smoke, and when the king's army finally broke through, the fighting was not a battle but a culling. Muskets and pikes tore through crowds of untrained villagers. Mothers were cut down beside sons, Priests were slaughtered as they tried to shield their churches, and entire families were left in the fields, like abandoned sacks of grain. Witnesses later wrote that the rivers ran red, that corpses stacked upon one another made hills along the roadside, that the cries of the dying echoed for days. Conservative estimates say 3,000 to 5,000 civilians were killed, perhaps more. Because in the chaos of state-sanctioned carnage, bodies are seldom counted carefully. But what is most chilling is not the number, nor the brutality, but the fact that Edward, upon receiving news of the massacre, did not flinch. He recorded the rebellion in his journal with the same vacant tone he used for weather or accounts of executions, noting only that the insurgents had been put down and the king's peace restored. As if peace could ever grow from fields drenched in the blood of farmers who had asked only to speak to God in their own familiar tongue. In the villages of Devon and Cornwall, the aftermath settled like a permanent winter. Churches remained, stripped bare. Families were left without fathers or brothers or sons. And the silence that followed the carnage was not the silence of prayer, but of shock. A hollow quiet that thickened in the air like the smoke of burned homes. Survivors wandered among the dead, searching not for justice, but for recognition, for any sign that someone, somewhere, understood the enormity of what had happened here. But Edward did not visit, did not send comfort. It did not question whether the God he believed in would have approved of such cleansing by the sword. He was a child king who had been taught that fire purifies, and so he accepted the massacre as the natural outcome of righteousness, and in that acceptance lay the first great shadow of his reign. Because the lesson he took from Devon and Cornwall was disastrously simple rebellion, even when born of grief, must be crushed without mercy. And the king's will, no matter how young the king, must be enforced with the full violence of heaven and earth. From this point onward, Edward's kingdom would know that dissent was not merely disobedience, but sin. And sin, in the mind of a boy, reared on doctrine instead of compassion, was something to be cast into the flames until nothing remained but ash. There are tragedies that unfold loudly, with blades drawn and banners raised. But the tragedy that seeped across England during Edward VI's reign crept in with the quiet persistence of a slow, poisonneux fog. A fog that rose not from battlefields, but from fields left barren, cottage left empty, and hearts left stripped of hope. After the flames of the Devon and Cornwall uprising died down, the kingdom did not return to peace. Instead, it slipped into a deeper suffering, one made not of sudden violence, but of slow deprivation. Because the very policies that Edward approved, policies crafted in distant chambers by men who had never walked through a hungry village, began to choke the lives of ordinary people in ways even fire could not match. And while the boy king read scripture and copied Latin tables with perfect handwriting, families across England learned the taste of hunger so sharp it carved them from the inside out. The first sign of disaster appeared in the countryside when wealthy landowners, encouraged by policies meant to reform agriculture, began enclosing vast stretches of land, with fences so high and so mercilessly straight that they looked like scars carved across the landscape. These enclosures pushed peasants off fields they had farmed for generations, leaving them wandering the roads with no livelihood and no claim to the earth beneath their feet. Sheep replaced people, wool replaced bread, and profits replaced communities. Entire villages, emptied as families, packed whatever meager belongings they had and walked until their legs trembled, searching for work in towns already overflowing with the displaced. And as more and more people were turned out of their homes, the roads of England became graveyards of the living, filled with ragged men, hollow-eyed women, and children whose ribs pressed against skin, like the framework of an unfinished coffin. The government's response to the swelling tide of homelessness was not compassion, it was punishment. In Edward's England, poverty was treated not as misfortune, but as crime. And the laws written during his reign revealed a terrifying logic. If the poor were suffering, then the poor must be immoral. And if they were immoral, they must be corrected through pain. The Vagabonds Act, cold and merciless, allowed authorities to arrest anyone found wandering without employment, to brand a hot iron in the shape of a V onto their chest or face, marking them as less than human. A warning to all who looked upon them that they were failures in the eyes of the state and of God. Some branded vagabonds were forced into slavery for 2 years, others for life, and many were simply beaten or hanged. Their bodies left dangling from trees along the roadside as a grim reminder that suffering was no excuse for disobedience. It was during these months that the stories began to spread, whispered in dark corners of taverns and behind market stalls. Stories of children collapsing in the dirt beside the bodies of their parents. Stories of mothers tearing scraps of cloth to quiet babies, too weak to cry. Stories of old men wandering in circles until they lay down beneath hedges and never rose again. Visitors described sickening scenes, cottages with no fires burning, graves dug shallow because the living were too weak to dig deep, streets where the stench of decay mingled with the scent of unbaked dough, because ovens had nothing left to offer. And amid all this horror, Edward sat in his palace, pale and composed, unaware or unwilling to grasp that the kingdom he was purifying through doctrine was starving beneath the weight of his reforms. He received reports of poverty, of vagrancy, of unrest, and he read them with the same detached calm that had become his signature, making notations in the margins about legislation and divine order rather than relief. To the boy king, the suffering of the poor was not a call for mercy, but an affirmation of what he had been taught, that those who strayed from righteous order were punished by God, and that the role of the king was to enforce that divine discipline without flinching. In this belief, he found a strange, dangerous comfort, because it allowed him to view the hunger not as a consequence of his policies, but as a moral test for his subjects. A test they were failing in ways that only justified harsher measures, and so the cycle deepened. Hunger fed homelessness. Homelessness fed punishment. Punishment fed despair. And despair fed the slow collapse of communities that had once sustained England's beating heart. Meanwhile, the nobles enriched themselves, their estates swelling with land, stolen from the very people whose labor had once nurtured it. And they praised Edward's firmness as if it were wisdom rather than indoctrinated rigidity. They walked the halls of court in embroidered sleeves and perfume, leaving behind them the faint scent of privilege that never reached the countryside, where the air carried only the smells of mud, sickness, and the sweet, rotting odor of unattended corpses. And still Edward did not see it. Or perhaps he saw it but lacked the emotional muscle to understand it. For the child who had never known affection could not recognize suffering, and the child who had never felt comfort could not imagine offering it. By the time winter settled over England, the kingdom felt as though it were collapsing inward, like a body starving to the point where bones begin to bend. Fires burned low, bellies remained empty, and the laws continued to tighten like a noose around the throats of the desperate. And in the dead of night, while the last scraps of warmth fled from cottages with broken roofs, Edward VI, boy, king, victim, and architect slept beneath heavy blankets, dreaming not of the hungry but of Scripture, imagining himself chosen, imagining himself righteous, imagining himself the savior of a land he was slowly helping destroy. Thus, the winter of Edward's reign revealed a truth more chilling than the cold itself. A kingdom can survive war, rebellion, and even a tyrant. But it cannot survive a child who wields power with the purity of fanaticism and the emptiness of someone who has never been taught that lives, especially poor lives, are fragile, precious, and easily extinguished. And as the snow deepened and the fields lay barren, England entered a quiet season of agony, a season that would shape the terror yet to come. There are thieves who creep through shadows, slipping silently into houses with the fear of discovery trembling in their bones. And then, there are thieves who walk in daylight with royal signatures in their pockets. Thieves who do not need to hide, because the crown itself opens the doors for them. And during the reign of Edward VI, the greatest theft in the history of England was carried out not by outlaws, but by educated gentlemen wearing velvet sleeves, riding fine horses, and carrying official parchment, declaring that God himself approved of what they were about to destroy. The plundering of England's churches did not begin with an explosion of violence, but with a quiet decree, a smooth line of text written in elegant script, announcing that the old relics were superstitious, that gold chalices were unnecessary, that sacred vessels were idolatrous. And thus, in the name of purity, everything that gave the church its beauty, weight, and warmth was ordered to be taken, melted, sold, or shattered until nothing remained but the bare bones of buildings that had once pulsed with centuries of human devotion. In parish after parish, government commissioners arrived with cold faces and sharp quills, compiling inventories of every object: candlesticks, chalices, embroidered cloths, carved crucifixes, painted panels, cataloging them like undertakers, taking notes on the body of a dying civilization. They did not come at night, because they had no reason to hide. They came during morning light, when villagers gathered to watch their own past hauled away in carts, the wheels creaking beneath the weight of gold and silver that had once been touched by trembling hands during weddings, funerals, baptisms, confessions, and the countless small rituals that thread human lives into meaning. The people watched quietly, powerless to intervene, because resisting royal commissioners meant treason, and treason meant death. And so they stood in the ruined doorways of churches that had sheltered their grandparents and their grandparents' grandparents, watching men in fine coats carry away the heart of the only community they had ever known. The destruction did not stop at objects. It moved deeper, slicing into the walls themselves. Frescoes painted generations earlier saints with solemn eyes, angels suspended in gentle flight. Scenes of nativity and resurrection were scraped off with metal blades until the plaster beneath wept white dust, leaving behind blank, ghostly scars where beauty had once lived. Stained glass windows, glowing like jewels when sunlight touched them, were shattered into brittle fragments that crunched underfoot as commissioners worked, their boots grinding centuries of artistry into meaningless shards. Schwar books, illuminated by monks who had spent their lives bent over pages, were thrown into piles and set aflame, the fire devouring the vibrant inks and delicate gold leaf, until the only thing left of them was ash drifting upward in thin spirals, ascending like souls escaping a body already too broken to contain them. And as all this unfolded, Edward VI sat in his study, a small figure surrounded by towering shelves of theological texts, reading reports of the plunder with serene approval. To him, this was not robbery, but purification. Not desecration, but renewal. He had been taught that beauty was dangerous, that gold was a temptation, that images were idols. And so he believed, with a child's wholehearted trust, that stripping the churches bare was an act of devotion. When he read about melted chalices, he imagined holiness regained. When he read about broken statues, he imagined a kingdom freed from superstition. When he read about ancient manuscripts burned in courtyards, he imagined enemy lies being cast into the fires of righteousness. He never saw the women weeping in doorways, the old men clutching rosaries hidden in pockets, the children staring at hollow altars where candles no longer flickered. He never smelled the smoke of burning hymnals or felt the cold emptiness of a gutted cathedral. He saw only words, and in those words, carefully curated, dutifully presented, he saw success. Meanwhile, those enforcing the plundering grew rich beyond imagining. Nobles who had once pretended piety now stripped monasteries of silver plate, pocketed funds stolen from charity chests, purchased sacred property for pennies, and watched their estates swell with the wealth of God's house. Bishoprics crumbled. Hospitals founded by monks closed their doors to the sick. Schools that had educated poor children were dissolved. And the vast network of charity that the church had once provided evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum that no government office was prepared to fill. The rich feasted. The officials pocketed gold. And the poor, already starving from enclosure and displacement, now lost the last refuge they had. The church that had once fed them, sheltered them, protected them from the worst cruelties of winter and fortune. The saddest part of all was not the greed itself, but the finality with which the destruction landed. A church stripped of its sacred vessels becomes more than empty. It becomes wounded. A cavern that echoes strangely, because its heart has been torn out. Villagers described walking into their parish churches after the commissioners left and feeling as though they were stepping into a corpse. A cold, echoing body whose spirit had fled. The altars were bare stone, the walls blank, the colors faded or gone entirely, and the soft mystery that had lingered for generations was replaced by an austerity so harsh it felt like punishment. And as the wind passed through broken windows and birds nested in rafters once warmed by candle smoke, and the people understood that something irreversible had happened, not just to the building but to England itself. Edward, meanwhile, continued writing in his journal, his entries neat and detached, cataloging the destruction with the same unflinching calm that had marked his every response to suffering. He wrote of wealth redistributed, of superstition overthrown, of God glorified. And he never paused to consider the cost, because cost human, emotional, spiritual was not a concept he had been taught to measure. To him, purification through destruction made perfect sense, for he had never known anything else. By the end of this great robbery, England had lost not only treasures but memory, not only gold, but identity. And the echo of that loss would linger long after Edward himself succumbed to his own brief, painful fate. For now, though, the kingdom returned each Sunday to churches stripped bare of beauty, where sermons thundered from pulpits that once whispered comfort, and where the people prayed not for salvation but for survival in a world that had grown colder, harder, and infinitely more empty under the rule of a child who believed that tearing things down was the holiest act he could perform. There are deaths that shake a kingdom precisely because they do not come from distant battlefields or shadowed conspiracies, but from within the warm, familiar walls of home. And the deaths that unfolded in Edward VI's palace during the middle years of his short reign carried a dread far deeper than any public execution, because they revealed something about the boy that no rebellion or famine had yet fully exposed. Edward did not merely accept violence done in his name. He authorized it with the calm conviction of someone who believed his family's blood was no more sacred than any heretic's if it stood in the way of divine order. The first to fall was Thomas Seymour, the charming, ambitious uncle who had once bounced Edward on his knee, carried him through palace corridors, whispered to him about ships and soldiers and the bright future that awaited him. But affection, to Edward, was not a memory that softened judgment. It was a detail irrelevant to the machinery of righteousness that had been built around him since birth. The charges against Thomas were messy, woven of ambition, political maneuvering, and the kind of restless hunger for power that seems to infect those who orbit the throne too closely. But what terrified the court was not the charges themselves. Men had lost their heads for far less. It was the way Edward reacted when informed. He did not cry. Though he was still only a boy, he did not ask why the uncle who once told him bedtime stories would suddenly be called traitor. He did not ask for mercy, clemency, or explanation. Instead, he listened with a stillness so absolute that the counselors reporting the crime felt their mouths dry. Because the boy's silence did not feel like innocence, it felt like judgment. And when they placed before him the warrant that would send Thomas Seymour to the block, Edward signed it with a steady hand, his quill gliding across parchment, as though he were marking a simple note in his journal. Later he wrote about the execution in that same journal with chilling brevity. The Lord Admiral was condemned to death and died. That was all. Not a word about childhood memories. Not a word about betrayal. Not a word about grief. If the palace had hoped that this first family execution would leave some mark on the boy, some tremor of doubt or sorrow, they soon discovered that Edward's heart was made not of cold stone, which at least remembers warmth, but of something harder, smoother, untouched by human heat. For scarcely had the palace recovered from Thomas Seymour's death, when the second uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the man who had shielded Edward from political storms, carried him after his father's death, and served as his Lord Protector, fell out of favor. Somerset was no saint. He was ambitious, stubborn, and often arrogant. But he had loved the boy in his own flawed way, and loved him enough to try steering the kingdom in directions he believed safe. Yet even that affection could not survive the ruthless currents of Tudor politics. And when his rivals whispered their accusations, when they painted him as dangerous, controlling, a threat to the purity of the government, Edward believed God had commanded. The boy once again did not question. He listened, he nodded, and he allowed the second uncle to be led to the scaffold. There were courtiers who wept for Somerset. There were servants who prayed for him. There were whispers that perhaps the king, still a child in years if not in heart, would relent at the last moment. But Edward did not relent. He remained in his chambers, writing neat lines in his journal as the axe rose and fell outside. And when news came that the execution was done, he merely dipped his quill and recorded, "The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off." That was all. No mention of the man who had carried him as an infant, who had tucked him into bed, who had shielded him from the darkest shadows of court life. To Edward, loyalty was not emotional, it was doctrinal. And doctrine had no place for hesitation. After Somerset's fall, a strange quiet settled over the palace. The kind of quiet that comes not from peace but from fear. Because the people closest to the king, the tutors, the attendants, the scribes began to understand that the child they served had a mind so rigid, so thoroughly shaped by religious instruction, that nothing of human affection had been allowed to soften its edges. They walked more carefully. They bowed more deeply. They used fewer words in his presence, as though each wrong syllable might be interpreted as sin. Even older statesmen avoided meeting the boy's eyes for too long. Because Edward had a way of staring that was neither cruel nor kind. It was scrutinizing, analytical, the way a theologian examines a text for error. And in those pale, steady eyes, they saw no flicker of regret for the uncles who had died. Only certainty. But the deepest horror lay not in Edward's indifference, it lay in his conviction. He believed, truly, and without hesitation, that God had commanded him to purify England, to remove threats, to cleanse not only faith, but family, if necessary. He believed that righteousness demanded blood, and because he believed it, he felt no guilt. That is the terrible thing about a child raised on doctrine instead of affection. He does not know that mercy exists. He does not know that love can be a reason to stay a hand. He knows only rules, commandments, and a vision of the world in which those who fall out of favor fall into fire. And so the palace became a place of whispered dread. Not because the king shouted or raged, Henry VIII had done that, but because Edward did not shout or rage at all. His quietness became a weapon sharper than any sword. A constant reminder that behind the soft face of a boy lay a faith so unyielding, it could sever blood ties with the same ease. It severed the ropes that held heretics to their stakes. Thus Edward VI, the child who slept alone in cold chambers, who had never been hugged without purpose or kissed without calculation, carried out the deaths of both his uncles without trembling, without flinching, without even slowing the calm rise and fall of his breath. And the palace, smelling faintly of iron and candle wax, realized that they lived under a king who had never learned what it meant to love, but had already mastered what it meant to sacrifice others on the altar of righteousness. There are moments in a life when the body betrays the illusion of strength so completely that even the proudest mind is forced to confront its mortality. And for Edward VI, that moment came far earlier than anyone expected, creeping into his lungs like a cold, invisible serpent that coiled tighter each week, squeezing breath from his ribs until every inhale felt like a blade sliding beneath bone. It began quietly, with a cough that servants dismissed as a passing winter irritation. But soon the cough deepened, thickened, became violent enough to bend the boy in half, shaking his frail frame until flecks of blood appeared on his handkerchief like small red signatures of doom. The physicians gathered, whispering to each other about consumption, about fever, about humors gone rotten. But whatever words they used, the truth was always the same. The king was dying, and nothing in their apothecary jars could stop it. Edward tried at first to ignore the illness, burying himself in study, in scripture, in the endless reports of reform that soothed the rigid certainty of his mind. But disease does not care for doctrine, and soon the pain began to burn through him day and night. A slow, gnawing fire that hollowed his cheeks and sharpened his bones. His servants saw his nightclothes stained with blood, his pillow smeared with the pinkish residue of ruptured lungs, and yet the boy continued sitting at his desk, hunched and trembling, reading about religious purity with eyes that grew dimmer each passing day. The palace grew quieter with every labored breath he took. Servants tiptoeing past his chambers as though afraid their footsteps alone might break what remained of his strength. It was in this suffocating decline that a terrible thought began to take root in Edward's fevered mind. A thought that would shape the final months of his reign more powerfully than any law he had ever signed. What would become of England when he died? He was only 15. The bloom of childhood still clinging to his face, even as death carved lines through his skin. Yet he understood with chilling clarity that his reforms, his entire vision of a purified kingdom, would collapse the moment he stopped breathing. Because the two heirs waiting in the shadows were his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. And one of them, Mary, was Catholic to the bone. The idea of Mary ascending the throne did not merely frighten him, it horrified him to the core of his religious identity. In his fevered dreams he saw churches restored to ornament, Latin masses resurrected, images returned to walls he had ordered scraped bare. And in those nightmares he felt as though he were being erased, as though his own soul were being smothered under a flood of incense and rosaries. So he began to plot. The boy who had barely enough breath to climb stairs forced himself to sit upright for hours, drafting a new order of succession in handwriting that wavered with illness. Determined to remove both Mary and Elizabeth from the line of inheritance. Mary, he claimed, was unfit because of her faith. Elizabeth, he argued, was illegitimate. Neither was worthy of God's kingdom as he imagined it. Instead, he turned to Lady Jane Grey, a girl not much older than himself, pale and scholarly, steeped in Protestant belief, a girl he barely knew, but whose faith matched his so perfectly that he convinced himself she was the answer God had given him in his hour of despair. The council resisted at first, frightened of the chaos such a change would bring. But Edward's illness made him more terrifying, not less. For a dying king has nothing left to lose. And Edward clung to this decision with a fanatic ferocity that astonished even those who had known his rigidity best. As his lungs filled with fluid, as each cough tore through him like glass, he continued to insist on rewriting the future. He forced meetings from his sickbed, summoning anxious counselors to witness him gasping for breath, while declaring with tremulous certainty that England must be protected from Mary's idolatry. His voice cracked. His skin glistened with fever sweat. His hands trembled as he held out the documents for approval. But his conviction never wavered. The child who had been molded into a vessel of religious extremity believed he was performing his final duty to God. What no one told him, or perhaps what no one dared to tell him, was that Mary was already gathering strength outside the palace walls. As Edward lay dying, political alliances shifted like shadows at dusk. And the people, weary of famine, weary of purges, weary of the brutal changes he had forced through the land, he began to look toward Mary with a mixture of fear and hope, hoping that her rule, even if it brought back the old faith, might at least bring back stability. But Edward did not know this. In his fevered mind, he pictured England united behind Lady Jane Grey, pictured angels nodding in approval, pictured God smiling upon him for saving the nation from contamination. Fever is a strange and merciless companion. It paints nightmares as truth, and truth as temptation. And Edward's final weeks were spent clinging to an image of England that existed only in the trembling shadows of his imagination. In the palace corridors, the smell of sickness thickened like damp cloth. Servants carried basins filled with blood-tinged water from the royal chamber. Physicians leaned over the king with expressions that blended helplessness and dread. Counselors spoke in hushed tones, already calculating their own survival. But Edward, wrapped in blankets that did nothing to warm his bones, continued writing, continued insisting, continued believing he could shape a kingdom, even as death pressed against the inside of his ribs. He tried to pray, but found himself too weak to kneel. He tried to speak, but found his voice breaking into coughs that left him gasping. Bent over, eyes watering from pain. Still, he held to his decision. Mary must never be queen. The great irony, the profound, tragic irony, was that Edward's desperation to preserve his reforms would become the very spark that plunged England into one of its darkest spirals. His final act of defiance, the rewriting of the succession, was not the work of a calculating adult king, but the terrified flailings of a child who believed he was fighting for God. And when he signed those documents, With a hand so frail, the quill almost slipped. He unknowingly lit the fuse of a conflict that would explode the moment his heart stopped beating. Thus the dying boy king, thin as a shadow, lungs collapsing, skin burning with fever, spent his final breaths, not in peace, not in reflection, not in forgiveness, but in frantic attempts to control a future he would never see, a future that would turn against everything he believed in. Once the death he had tried to outrun finally claimed him in a small, dark room filled with the smell of blood and winter. There are deaths that come gently, like a soft hand closing a door behind a weary traveler. But Edward VI's death did not come gently. It came like a storm trapped inside his ribcage, tearing at flesh and breath with a violence made all the more unbearable by the youth of the body it ravaged. In the final nights of his life, Edward lay twisted beneath layers of damp sheets. His once pale face turned a sickly gray blue. His lips cracked from fever. His eyes sunken with the hollow shine of someone who has been fighting too long and is losing with every breath. His cough, once a nuisance, had deepened into something monstrous, a full-bodied convulsion that shook the bedposts, forced streams of pink foam from his mouth, and left him gasping through lungs that felt as though they were filling with drowning water. Servants hovered outside his chamber with bowls of bloody linens, their hands trembling because they knew what the crimson stains meant. The king's lungs were failing, tearing themselves open from the inside. Inside the chamber, the air grew heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the sour scent of fever sweat, and candles sputtered, as if they too were exhausted by witnessing a child's slow unmaking. Edward tossed and shivered, trying to whisper prayers between coughs that sounded like bones snapping, but each attempt dissolved into painful choking. At times he seemed lucid, staring into the darkness with wide, frightened eyes, whispering fragments of scripture he had memorized as a boy. But lucidity never stayed long. Fever dragged him back into delirium, where he cried out for his mother, Jane Seymour, a woman he had never known, but whose absence he felt keenly as the world began slipping from his grasp. Physicians hovered uselessly, offering powders and syrups that did nothing but thicken the mucus he could no longer swallow. And in their helplessness, they exchanged glances filled with dread, knowing that royalty did not make a child immune to death, nor to suffering. As dawn approached on his final day, Edward's body began to betray him more vividly. His fingers curled inward without his permission. His nails tinted purple from lack of oxygen. His breathing turned shallow, ragged. Each inhale a struggle, each exhale a surrender. The boy who had once sat so rigidly on the throne now writhed in pain. The thin frame that had signed death warrants, now trembling as though every nerve inside him had been set ablaze. Witnesses described the sound he made a wet, rattling gasp, known as the death rattle. The last grim music of lungs finally giving up, and even the soldiers stationed outside his chamber shivered because the sound did not belong to a king. It belonged to a child caught between terror and oblivion. And yet even as his body collapsed, Edward still clung to the belief that God watched him, judged him, demanded something of him. With the little breath he had left, he whispered for the succession documents, those fragile, fever-stained papers that disinherited his sisters and placed Lady Jane Grey upon the throne. He begged his council to honor them, though his voice came out in broken gasps and his words were punctuated by violent fits of coughing that left fresh streaks of blood across his pillow. His last coherent moments were not filled with peace, but with fear, not of death, but of Mary. In his mind, she was not a sister, but a specter of Catholicism returning to undo everything he had built, everything he had burned, everything he had believed God required. And so he tried, even in his final hour, to tighten his grip on a future he no longer had the strength to command. But the human body does not bargain with faith. It breaks. Just after nightfall, Edward's final collapse came with terrifying suddenness, a violent seizure of the lungs that bent his thin torso upward. His eyes widening in pure instinctive panic as he fought for air that simply would not come. Servants rushed forward. Physicians shouted useless orders. Counselors froze in shock. But the boy was already beyond help. His body convulsed once, twice, then zagged, the final breath escaping him in a long, wet rattle that echoed through the chamber like a door slamming shut on a life that had never been allowed to be a childhood. And then came the silence, that dreadful, cavernous silence that fills a room when a soul has fled. But the pain it endured still lingers in the air like smoke. Edward VI died at 15 years old. His body broken, his lungs drowned, his skin bruised with fever. And the kingdom did not weep for him, not truly. The counselors bowed their heads. The servants crossed themselves. But the people outside the palace felt something far more complex than grief. Some whispered relief, for his harsh reforms had left their villages barren. Some whispered fear, for they knew the succession would not unfold peacefully. And some whispered that God had taken him as a warning, a reminder that zealotry burns, even the vessel that carries it. But the true disaster came after his death, because the moment his corpse cooled, the delicate threads of his last political scheme snapped. His attempt to replace Mary with Lady Jane Grey lasted mere days, 9 days. To be precise, before the nation, weary of suffering and chaos, swept Jane aside and raised Mary upon the throne. And Mary, filled with her own fiery convictions, would unleash her own wave of flames upon England. Burnings, purges, revenge baptisms of blood. Edward's reforms would collapse. But the hatred he helped ignite would not. The fire simply changed hands. The dawn after Edward's death rose pale and cold, its light falling upon a throne room that suddenly felt larger than life. As though the absence of a king had carved a hollow space no adult could fill without trembling. His body, wrapped in cloth, was carried silently down the corridors he had once walked with rigid piety. And the servants who bore him felt the strange weight of a child who had died old. A boy whose heart had never been taught love. A sovereign whose reign had been carved from doctrine, fear, and isolation. Thus ended the life of Edward VI, a child raised to be a weapon. A king whose hands were steady, but whose soul had been starved. A boy who destroyed more than he ever understood, and whose death marked not peace but the opening of yet another long shadow over England. A shadow that would stretch across reigns, across generations, carried forward by the very flames he believed were holy.